I don't think SBRs change the world. I don't think Saylor's, acquisition of Bitcoin changes the world. I think it's how people ultimately end up using it that changes the world. They pay me in Bitcoin. Like, we operate on a Bitcoin standard. It does work. And we primarily use on-chain. Do you want to have Bitcoin in self-custody that you control? I mean, that's like true financial self-sovereignty. Or do you want to be, have your Bitcoin tied up as collateral in a lending product? They really need to ask themselves, why am I in Bitcoin? And if it's because of freedom and self-sovereignty and all the things that we talked about, the cypherpunks, then just buy Bitcoin. The closer that we can bring these determinations to home, the better. And that's why I think the individual, the family unit, those are the ultimate entities to be making these decisions. You're not a core developer, and so you shouldn't have an opinion. And to me, that's a very dangerous position to take. Lower your time preference. The barrier to spend and replace, to go on River, go on wherever you buy your Bitcoin and immediately replace the Bitcoin that you just spent. I mean, it's almost no barrier.
Hi, Michael Jordan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Robin. Good to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. We just met not even a week ago, in Vegas. It's been a pleasure seeing you. And how was the conference for you, actually?
It was great. I know the Bitcoin conference gets a lot of heat for some of the sponsors and some of the talks, and that. For me, it's just an awesome networking opportunity to get to meet you in person and lots of clients. We have some unbelievable clients and a lot of partners. I've got some new podcast guests who are going to be coming on because of it. So no complaints on my end.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And we soon have a little bit higher signal Bitcoin conference in Prague coming up. Are you also coming to Prague?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to be speaking on the main stage in Prague. One of my first big keynotes in Prague here in a couple of weeks. So I'm preparing for that. And it was something our chief marketing officer was supposed to be speaking. He's taken on a new project, and so I get to talk about one of my passions in Bitcoin, which is Bitcoin as money, and using Bitcoin as money, and transacting in it, those sorts of things. And I'm really looking forward to it. I think it'll be a good time.
Awesome. I think it's also good, before we get started with all the topics, maybe give the people some of your backgrounds, who you are and why you're excited about Bitcoin.
Yeah. So I've been in Bitcoin just a few years. So my journey started in late 2021. At the end of every year, I set goals for the following year. Right, I have New Year's resolutions, and one of my New Year's resolutions each year is to learn about a new topic of interest. In late 2021, I decided I need to learn about this whole crypto thing. What's going on in the world? Why are people so excited about it? And I was fortunate right at the end of the year, as I was kind of gathering resources, books, podcasts to listen to, I met a guy through a friend who was interested as well. And he told me, he said, there's kind of this Bitcoin or this crypto horseshoe, this path that people take where they start in Bitcoin and then they go through the crypto phase and then they ultimately generally make their way back to Bitcoin. And so he gave me the name of Preston Pish's podcast. He told me about Lynn Alden. Those are the two people in particular I remember. And he told me, start with Preston's podcast on episode 1 and listen all the way through. And so I think he was, I think Preston was maybe 50 something episodes in that. I think he's now, in the several hundreds. And so I did. And it was throughout 2022, as you remember, that everything started collapsing. Crypto, you saw Celsius, BlockFi, FTX, all of that stuff. And I began to realize as Bitcoin was making more and more sense to me, but I realized, wow, the Bitcoin maxis, these toxic maxis are right about everything, And so I would say sometime, late 2022, I was all in. I realized that was Bitcoin was the signal amongst the noise. And I've had quite a journey since, a lot of life changes, making it to the Bitcoin way to work with this team now. But it's been quite a ride.
What do you think is something that right now most Bitcoiners would disagree with, but the toxic Bitcoin maxis are kind of pushing?
You broke up for a minute there. I lost all audio.
Oh, are you hearing me now?
1 second. I don't know if it's my speakers or I don't know if it's your.
I hear you perfectly fine.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, I lost speakers here. Here, say that again.
You hear me again?
Yeah, now I can. It kicked over to a different speaker. Huh. So what is something that Bitcoiners what?
You hear me now again?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I hear you perfectly fine. Usually when someone kicks out, it gets messy, but you are very clear. Like I think you have a good internet connection also.
Okay, good. So I'm sorry. Ask your question again, then.
I was asking because you said like the toxic Bitcoin max is the one is always right, and I tend to agree with that. That those who push like the hard things at the current moment, you're like, hey, like they're pushing really hard, but then they end up being right at at the end of the cycle. What do you think is one thing that a lot of Bitcoiners would disagree with, or like is right now kind of mainstream, but the toxic Bitcoin maxis are kind of pushing for now?
That's a good question. So I don't. It's sometimes hard to distinguish the toxic maxis from the general maxis. I think something for me that stands out is there are a small handful of people who I think are concerned about what some of these Bitcoin lending products mean and what the implications are. I would say I tend to fall toward a more overtly toxic maxi position on many of those things. And so my general position on them is first of all, it's a free market, right? If Strike or any of these companies want to offer those sorts of products, I think they have every right to do so. I think everyone has a right to enter a contractual agreement and make a determination as to whether or not that's a fit for them. I think that the challenge for most people is that most people are very bad at evaluating risk. And they think the risk is, well, what's the price of Bitcoin going to do, and how much of my stack am I going to put up as collateral to take out a loan, and what's the interest rate, and they kind of do this very simple math. And I think that the risk extends way beyond that in a very meaningful and impactful way to, well, who are the counterparties, who's securing it, how much of your sensitive information are you giving up because of KYC. What's the regulatory risk, exposure to a 6102 style attack? We see all this. The U.S. government right now is talking about blowing up the debt ceiling and just saying it doesn't exist anymore. Obviously, they think things are bad if they're doing that, as Trump and Elizabeth Warren have said, to avoid economic catastrophe. So in a catastrophic situation, do they come for your Bitcoin? Do they shut these companies down? Do they somehow intervene and create real problems for people? And I think most people probably just fail to recognize that those risks are not just hypothetical, but could actually come to fruition. Certainly in a catastrophic sort of situation. Us at the Bitcoin way, we're all about self-custody. I mean, really having Bitcoin outside of the system, where you control the private keys, that is like the holy grail that's what makes Bitcoin what it is. And I think there are a lot of people who are probably going to play around with sort of fiat products built on top of Bitcoin and pay the price. My caveat to that, I would say, is I think there are some Bitcoiners, short of a catastrophic, economic meltdown, there are some Bitcoiners who have enough Bitcoin, they understand the custodial risks, they've got, a stack sufficiently large to, cover collateral and 80% drawdown in Bitcoin's price, all of these sorts of things, that maybe they come out unscathed, and good for them if they do. But I don't think it's I think it's a product that far too many people are getting excited about, when there's probably 1% of the Bitcoin population who should really consider that as a viable option.
Interesting.
So that's my toxic maxi position, I guess.
I think it's a common sense position, honestly. The idea, if you think about it, first principles is like, let's say because this loan to value is usually like around 50%. So if you, for example, want to have $50,000, and like if it's lower than that, I would question why you're even doing it. But if you want $50,000, you have to give out $100,000 in Bitcoin. So you basically give out a full Bitcoin to get $50,000 in fiat back, and you are inclined to have risks. Like the Bitcoin can be, like, even if they are acting in best interest, maybe it gets stolen from the platform, maybe the platform goes under. Like, there's so many, even if you assume everyone is a good actor, even then there's so many risks associated with that. And I don't like the idea that retail is giving up Bitcoin to get fiat. Like that concept is just like really foreign to me, and like it does not make sense. And it's really interesting because I mentioned it on the podcast with Tony. Tony in the Bitcoin way pushed me to accept Bitcoin payments. I did not accept Bitcoin payments actually before Tony, and Tony's like, "Oh, why are you not accepting Bitcoin payments?" And he's totally right. And now I think like 70 or 80% of my income is fully directly in Bitcoin. So that's definitely a thanks to Tony and the Bitcoin way. And naturally, I came to the conclusion that I either have to sell Bitcoin to cover fiat bills, or I have to borrow against my Bitcoin, or I just have to get loans in other ways. And I ultimately decided to just sell my Bitcoin. Like I still make more Bitcoin each month, but I sell some Bitcoin to cover the fiat bills and not borrow against them. If you have like 10% you can pay in Bitcoin, but you get 70% paid in Bitcoin. And it's a way better system for me to just have like the emotional calmness to deal with the volatility and everything like that. And I think it's more the Bitcoiner way, the Bitcoin way. I love the name of the company also.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the other complaint I maybe have is one that's more philosophical, and I'll be speaking about it in Prague in a couple of weeks. Is I believe Bitcoin is money, and I know there's a lot of philosophizing about what money is and how do we define it. But to me, is good money stores as a serve of value. You can use it as a medium of exchange, and it can account for value. It's a measuring stick for value. And the reason Bitcoin does all of those things well is because it's scarce, it's decentralized, all of these things that we talk about. My other concern, I guess, with these products is that it doesn't push forward the narrative and the adoption of Bitcoin as all of those use cases. If it's easy to slide into this place of complacency where you say, well, I'll just take out a loan, use Bitcoin as collateral, and I'll keep using fiat. I think what we need to be doing proactively is urging and encouraging and maybe even demanding our suppliers, vendors, local stores, your local farmer, whoever it is, to accept Bitcoin as payment. And if you know that you have what perceives to be a free lunch of this, loan that you take out fiat and keep paying with fiat, we continue to feed into the system, right? We perpetuate that. And I understand the practical reality that today, if I go to the my local grocery store, they're not going to accept Bitcoin, and I'm not probably going to talk a chain of, a grocery chain into accepting Bitcoin. But I think it's easy to just concede that to, these to the whims of companies and certainly governments. And the more that we can do to push forward Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, I think over time, that's how that application of our demand in the marketplace is what leads Bitcoin to winning in the way that I want it to win, because I think we need it to win in that way for the bright orange future. If it's exclusively a store of value and it's just governments buying it and it's just corporations holding it forever and ever, I mean, good. I think the value is going to go up. It's a scarce, digital asset. It has all these advantages, but we need it to be the medium of exchange use case before I think we, see the end of forever wars, for example, before we see a lot of the net benefits that we anticipate, a Bitcoin standard bringing into the world.
One question that I always have is like, are we trying to pull the future a little bit too fast forward into the present of like Bitcoin has to prove it's a store of value, and then we can also have the medium of exchange, and maybe we want the medium of exchange too quick and we're not yet over the store of value phase, like the natural phases of like how money progresses.
It's a good question. I think that there are people who, if they understood, there are a lot of people, to your point, who understand that you're doing a podcast, you understand the store of value use case. You weren't accepting Bitcoin at one point in time, and it took Tony pushing you. But now you guys are adding to this like Bitcoin circular economy together, because we only use Bitcoin. We operate on a Bitcoin standard. And so I think there's something to be said that there are a lot of people who haven't acknowledged Bitcoin as a store of value yet. They're just asleep at the wheel. They're not paying attention, or they haven't been sold yet. Yeah, they're not going to accept Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, probably. I will say that the farmer who supplies me raw goat milk is going to accept Bitcoin from me. She doesn't know anything about Bitcoin. She kind of understands that there's something to this whole thing, and it's no skin off her back. And so there are probably easy asks in your life that you could ask people to accept as a medium of exchange. But I think it's a trap to assume that everyone has to, or everyone or some very large majority of people have to acknowledge the store of value before those of us who already understand the store of value can begin migrating to the medium of exchange use case. And I think there are a lot of, very entrepreneurial Bitcoiners out there who could begin accepting Bitcoin who currently aren't. And it's just sort of this thing that will build upon itself as we extend out and continue to educate the people who maybe aren't there yet, haven't accepted it as store of value. So I'm not really concerned about pulling that future back too soon. I think I would err on the side of caution that if we don't push for and promote that as Bitcoiners, especially within our own circle of people who generally, align with us on the role of Bitcoin in the world, I think that to me seems to be a bigger risk than pushing it off, further.
It's interesting.
I'm sorry, pulling it forward too soon, rather.
I had Jeff Booth on, I think like 2 months ago, something like that, and he said something that kind of stuck in my brain ever since, and I've mentioned it probably like 10 times already in the podcast. He said the sentence: "If Bitcoin fails as a medium of exchange, it will also fail as a store of value." I'm 100% undecided on that one, just because like we have a store of values like real estate and gold that are horrible medium of exchanges in the current world, but they still have a lot of value. But at the same time, I'm like, if gold also would be the best medium of exchange, the store of value would be so much bigger. So how do you look at the one requiring the other one in both directions?
Yeah, so I've heard Jeff Booth share that on several occasions. I'm a big fan of Jeff Booth, love him, and he's a guy who puts his money where his mouth is, and I think I've learned a lot from him. For the reason you described there, would tend to probably disagree, though I'm completely open to being wrong about this one. That I think Bitcoin can still serve as a store of value, even if it never achieves like broad medium of exchange adoption. And the reason, like you said, is you've got gold. I mean, gold's appreciating value. No one practically is using gold as a medium of exchange. I mean, for obvious reasons. It's heavy, it's expensive to insure and secure and ship. And we live in a global digital world, and a piece of metal isn't an effective medium of exchange in any, at scale, I guess, even if governments might settle in that. I think, and that's why you see a lot of paper gold out there and IOUs and those sorts of things. So I think that Bitcoin can't, and I think this is maybe the trap, is that Bitcoiners don't fully buy into Jeff Booth's thesis, because I think he could be incorrect about that. I think it could serve as a store of value. And so we hold on to the Bitcoin, which I think is a good thing to do. I think I save in Bitcoin. I think other people should save in Bitcoin. As though them becoming rich over some long period of time is the end all. To me, the end all is the bright orange future that we talk about. And it's very easy for you to get sucked into this narrative of Bitcoin as a store of value and a reserve asset and an investment, and to perceive it exclusively as a store of value. And the thing I always say is, if ultimately militaries aren't using Bitcoin to buy fighter jets, then I don't think the forever wars end. And that doesn't mean that your Bitcoin may not appreciate in value, and that you own one Bitcoin and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, your purchasing power isn't enormous. Yeah, I think that's probably very likely. But do we live in a materially better world? I'm less convinced of that.
It's also interesting when we look at the stages that are filled with people. For example, Michael Saylor is a big one, but now we have many more CEOs that use Bitcoin as a treasury asset, like MetaPlanet. I think Simon Gerovich, I maybe I butcher his name now, and then we have Semler Scientific with Eric Semler, many others examples, and many, like those are just the bigger ones, and there are many smaller companies. Is that kind of where maybe just like the narrative right now comes of Bitcoin as a treasury company, and then retail sees all those companies are lending, getting like $1 billion to buy Bitcoin at 0% interest rate. So I also want to do something similar. That this is kind of the reason why store of value and those borrow against the Bitcoin and lending products are kind of really pushed now?
Yeah, I think that. So first of all, I'm not here to disparage anyone. I think Michael Saylor is a financial genius. I think he's going to be the wealthiest man in the world here in the very near future, certainly in the next 5 or 10 years. And I think his conviction in Bitcoin, because of his conviction in Bitcoin, that will be well deserved. I think that as his Bitcoin journey has gone on, because I remember listening to him my first year or two in Bitcoin, learned a lot. I've been less impressed with the narrative that he's pushing. Now, where I empathize with his situation is he has a publicly traded company that is, he's got regulators and auditors and all sorts of people paying a lot of attention to what he's doing, whether he's in Bitcoin or not. My concern is that to frame Bitcoin, to pigeonhole it as exclusively digital capital, which is generally the narrative. I don't listen to him quite as frequently as I used to, but to frame Bitcoin in that way, really, I think it's a disservice to people who are trying to figure out what Bitcoin is sort of in totality. And that's where I think we see more and more people. Like I've seen a lot of people online. They're like, "Oh, I'm not going to Steak and Shake. I'm not going to spend my Bitcoin." And to me, it's like lower your time preference. Like the barrier to spend and replace, to go on River, go on wherever you buy your Bitcoin, and immediately replace the Bitcoin that you just spent is. It's almost no barrier. It's a really bad excuse to say, well, I'm not going to spend it. Just replace it. It's, a pretty straightforward thing. You can do it on your phone right there. And I do think, though, that as governments talk about SBRs, all of the attention that Saylor gets about the accumulation of Bitcoin he's doing, and he's talking about never selling, I think it creates this unhelpful narrative to those of us who are trying to educate people on Bitcoin for the purpose of money that changes the world. I don't think SBRs change the world. I don't think Saylor's, acquisition of Bitcoin changes the world. I think it's how people ultimately end up using it that changes the world. And so you sort of have to step back and just say, well, what's my goal with Bitcoin? If your goal with Bitcoin is just to get wealthy, like, okay, yeah, maybe, have your own strategic reserve and that's it. If your goal is, I want a brighter future for my kids, I want, the elimination of forever wars, I want incentives to realign. So all of the nonsense that we see every day in the news, it begins to, disappear. Then I think we need to reframe and reorient ourselves to Bitcoin as peer-to-peer electronic cash. And the fact that it's programmable, engineered money means that new solutions are going to come about to make that even easier. There's going to be more, self-custodial options out there. It's going to be, lower friction over time for people to enter and use Bitcoin the way I believe it was not only designed to be used, but ought to be used for promotion of a much better, more prosperous world.
How important do you think for Bitcoin overall it is what kind of narrative there currently is in Bitcoin, in the Bitcoin community? What is kind of like the push narrative?
How important do I think it is that we promote Bitcoin in with the proper narrative
The kind of where I want to go is because there are many different narratives in the Bitcoin community depending on what time you live in. So if we go back in the time machine to 2015, where the Bitcoin community was completely different, there was a lot of a different narrative in the community. When you go back in, 2012, I was not in the Bitcoin community in both of those times, but I can imagine it's probably a lot different to the narrative that is now into the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I'm just wondering if that narrative is just adapting to what is currently the level we're playing at. And right now we are coming into companies and to even nations adopting it. So I'm like, how important is it to keep that Bitcoin ethos, that Cypherpunk ethos, that peer-to-peer cash ethos in the community? Mm-hmm. And is there a chance, if that ethos and that narrative is kind of lost, that maybe also the core properties slowly get lost because everyone is kind of IOUing his on Bitcoin?
Yeah, no, I think that's a real risk. I think Bitcoin The protocol is probably as cypherpunk as it's ever been. I think Bitcoiners are not. And I think it's very easy for people to get caught up in these more modern narratives of what Bitcoin is and to lose an appreciation for the importance of self-sovereignty. I think it's why, we're yelling at people from the mountaintops to get your coins off of the exchanges. And, we still have clients every day coming to us and say, oh, I've got my coins at Coinbase or whatever. The beauty of Bitcoin is not simply that it's decentralized, it's scarce, it's censorship resistant. Like all of those are critical attributes it must retain to succeed in the way I think most Bitcoiners, toxic or otherwise, would. It needs to retain those. I think most people would agree with that. But the interesting thing for me that I've seen is more and more people are catching on to this thesis of, like, Larry Lepard's The Big Print, for example, right? And what are the implications of that? And if, we're 36, 37, almost 37 trillion in debt right now in the the US government. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that they're going to have to print a lot of money in that. And at some point they can't kick the can any further and things get really ugly. And so what do you want to have? Do you want to have Bitcoin in self-custody that you control? I mean, that's like true financial self-sovereignty. Or do you want to have your Bitcoin tied up as collateral in a lending product? Or do you want to have, if taken on debt to fund someone else's purchase of Bitcoin, and then they're, a derivative removed, custodying with a third party who's susceptible to hacks or a malicious employee, doing something wrong? And I think the cypherpunk narrative, and again, like I've been around 3 years. I wasn't on the original mailing list or anything of the white paper. But the further into it I get, the more convinced I am that the longer we can retain that narrative, the better. Because I know that as we sort of enter this early majority stage, we're going to have a lot less of that. And so the more people we can have who have been around for a couple of years, who at least do have some of that understanding of the importance of real self-sovereignty, the better we can educate more of that early majority as they come in. There are always going to be people who come in for exclusively number go up. It's an investment. They just allocate to the ETFs or what have you. But the higher percentage of people that we can have operating on a Bitcoin standard, trying to find ways to use Bitcoin, securing their own keys, running their own node, I think that's crucial to the ongoing success of the Bitcoin network, because who knows when the next, fork war is coming and BlackRock decides they want to, remove the hard cap or whatever. And they've got, I don't know how they have contractually agreed upon what happens in that sort of scenario with the holders of the ETFs. Certainly the people in power and whether it's the Larry Finks or the Jamie Dimons or politicians, they have much less incentive than people like you and I to use Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way. I mean, the legacy system has benefited them immensely. And the longer they can perpetuate that, they're going to. And so the more of us that can be running our own nodes, taking full control of our keys, all of these things that I think the cypherpunks talk about and emphasize, I think the more prepared we are for a better future. And it's not that I'm bearish on any of that stuff. It's that I have my concerns, and I think it needs to be a wake up call for many Bitcoiners. So stay focused. I know we talk about Omega candles and Wall Street adoption, all of these things. I know it's exciting for the price. We all want to be wealthy. Me too. I'm not pretending like I just simply don't care about number go up. But in terms of where I view my life 20 years from now, it's a much smaller piece of that puzzle. And I'm much more excited that I'm going to have control of what I do with my wealth and the flexibility to go where I want to go and do the things I want to do. And it's not exclusively because the purchasing power of Bitcoin has increased, although that's a piece of it, but it's because I control the purchasing power of the Bitcoin that I've accumulated at that time.
I see number go up technology as the Trojan horse for freedom. It's the one, like, I was not interested at all in any sovereignty rights. I was not cypherpunk at all before Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners and Bitcoin pushed me more and more in that direction. As I said, Tony was one part, but many others beforehand. Before I even started the podcast on Bitcoin Twitter, I love Twitter because they can be brutally honest and brutally direct sometimes, and I love that because it gives you actual feedback and not just like, oh, like, yeah, okay, do your thing. And to that extent, I'm very interested in how it plays out, because I see Saylor, for example, even adopting his speech and now saying also not just Bitcoin but crypto. He's still saying there's no second best, but not as much as previously. And now he's also talking about Bitcoin and crypto. How far does he just adjust his speech to be appealing to the vice president and the president, and be appealing to other people in the space to get kind of Bitcoin through the door? And he knows Bitcoin is anyways not destroyable, and it will also get the freedom technology in there once people just like get in, like, oh, like we need the number crop technology, but then we got the freedom. So it's like those fiat and this Bitcoin system. The Bitcoin system is kind of the Trojan horse for freedom, and the fiat system is trying to co-opt it. And I think Bitcoin will win out because open systems usually win out in the long run. But it's just so fascinating and interesting for me how the narrative, especially as a podcaster, and you probably also as a podcaster, the narrative is so interesting, how it shakes out and how different people have different stands on it. And with over 500 guests, have had many different views on this podcast on this topic.
Yeah, I think you're right to a large extent. Like when I came into Bitcoin, I mean, it was the number go up and all the buzz around crypto that intrigued me. I think it's just important that as few people stay in that mindset as possible. But as I said, it gets harder and harder over time. I think you and I and anyone who's sort of been in Bitcoin longer is we tend to be a more disagreeable, curious bunch of people who are open to maybe things aren't as they seem. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. Like I'm really disappointed with the way a lot of people now, including Michael Saylor, are framing Bitcoin. I didn't stick around for the entirety of his speech. I just, and it's no knock on him. It's just I feel like I've kind of heard the narrative and disagree with enough of it. It just wasn't. It wasn't very interesting to me. Always cool to see him. He's a great communicator, and I know people love him. I went to JD Vance's speech just because how often do you get to see the vice president, sitting vice president of the United States? But it was there was. I didn't walk away with any new information from a speech like that. And it was, just the Trump administration is doing this, and great if they break down regulatory barriers. Awesome. But I think in general, the extent to which we can ignore the talking heads, the better, and just focus in on our own lives. I mean, that's for me, the kicker is, and I'm giving away a little bit of my speech in Prague here in a couple of weeks. It's like being the change we want to see in the world has nothing to do with what Michael Saylor or JD Vance or Donald Trump or Elon Musk or fill in the blank, powerful, famous, wealthy person is doing. It has to do with what are the decisions you're making in your own life. Right? Like how are you choosing to save? How are you choosing to evade the theft that is taking place on a broad scale across the world by governments and others? And yeah, I mean, I think Saylor's crypto narrative, and it's like on one hand, I feel like he's saying there's no second best. On the other hand, he's saying, hey, look at all these fiat products that you can buy, through strategy. Maybe these are a second best, or maybe they are a first best. And I think some of that's maybe a complaint I have with the marketing of a lot of these Bitcoin treasury products. I do recognize that there are people, and this is like I sort of laid out like the philosophical disagreement. I think practically speaking, there are people who have a Bitcoin stack, kind of like the lending thing. They want to speculate on one of Strategy's products, and but I think most people, just like they don't understand counterparty risk of the fiat or the Bitcoin backed loans, they don't understand that you're basically giving money to Michael Saylor to go buy Bitcoin for his company. It's not a Bitcoin play. Like you're not buying Bitcoin, you're not doing Bitcoin or whatever it is you think you're doing. You're buying an equity or you're buying debt in a fiat company, and they just so happen to be buying Bitcoin with it. I'm all for, like, the thing I love about Seyr is his conviction in Bitcoin and the fact that he's one of the first very public corporate adopters of Bitcoin. I think individuals, families, companies should be buying Bitcoin. I think that's a very prudent thing to do. I feel very differently about governments buying Bitcoin for other reasons. But the fact that, like, here's maybe my biggest issue. If I owned a company, if I owned Strategy, what I feel like ethically would be the right way of approaching it would be, we're going to use free cash flow to buy Bitcoin. We're going to convert existing reserves into Bitcoin. And we're going to, I think those are probably the main ways. We're going to accept Bitcoin as payment, say. Okay. So like those are the ways we're going to accumulate Bitcoin. Michael Seyr is making the correct financial decision because he's able to buy way, way, way more Bitcoin accessing the credit markets, but at the expense of having to pull other people in to basically fund these purchases for him versus allowing his, from my understanding, I haven't looked in a while, but cash flow positive company to accumulate Bitcoin in a more conservative way. He'd have a lot less Bitcoin, but we'd also have a lot less people tied up in a fiat game that they think is somehow related to Bitcoin, And so, I think back, like my dad was a small business owner. He sold his business a few years ago. And he was never into Bitcoin. Unfortunately, I found it too late to fill him in, but it was a small company. They didn't have access to, 0%, debt. So he would have just had to take existing cash flows or his existing reserves and put it into Bitcoin. But I think that would have been a great way to do it. You end up with less Bitcoin perhaps, but you don't put a bunch of people at risk. You're not taking on a bunch of leverage. I don't think it makes you a triple maxi to take on lots and lots of risk and exposure to accumulate Bitcoin. Like I'm not here for the most possible dollars or even Bitcoin I can possibly get. It's how can I accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible in a way that I retain control over that Bitcoin. And so the narrative, how you go about it, I think all of that stuff matters. I think, again, I'll just reiterate this because I know anytime you talk about Michael Seyr, if it's not just, he's, the new Bitcoin Jesus, I know you get just railed on. I think what Michael Seyr is doing makes a lot of financial sense. I think that people should be very clear that they are buying a fiat product when they use any of his, the offerings that Strategy provides. And I think what most people should do is reorient themselves to the fact that what you're doing when you accumulate Bitcoin, like real Bitcoin in self-custody, is you're buying the money that we are betting the future uses, right? That we're accumulating this hard asset, this hard form of money that we'll be able to use, spend, save in innumerable ways 20 years from now. And a lot of people are just unaware of the capital gains implications and the custodial implications. And, the fact that they're really just playing a fiat game and it just happens to be someone else buying Bitcoin, quote unquote, on their behalf, but not really, because it's not yours. It's not an IOU. So there's just a lot of, I think, waking up around these narratives that people need to do. They really need to ask themselves, why am I in Bitcoin? And if it's because of freedom and self-sovereignty and all the things that we talked about, the cypherpunks, then just buy Bitcoin, take it into self-custody and ignore awesome. Like cheer Seyr on for adopting a Bitcoin, strategic reserve. But it doesn't mean you have to play that game also.
The first time I ever made any money, I got myself from that money a watch. And ever since then, I collect timepieces to remember times where I achieved some milestone. That's why I got the Bitcoin 2025 edition when I went to my first ever American Bitcoin conference. So for me, the Bitcoin watches from Coin Vigilante represents the time that we are living in. For every person that wears a Bitcoin watch, I know they are representing sound money to the outside world. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. Most people realize that way too late. If you have Bitcoin, you have to have a self-custody hardware wallet. But what are you doing if that hardware wallet breaks? Yeah, you wrote your seed phrase on paper. What if that paper is just dissolving or water is spilled on top of it? Paper is very, very non-durable. So you have to have a fire-resistant, water-resistant, and impact-proof method of securing your seed phrase so you can back up your keys. And to do that, you should use a solid titanium plate from Stampseed. Go to stampseed.com and use code Robin to get not 5 or 10, but 15% off your Stampseed. The most important thing for your Bitcoin journey is not buying Bitcoin, but it's how to keep them. And yes, you have maybe the right tools, but how do you actually go ahead and stick it all together so it's the most secure for you personally? Self-custody is a deeply personalized journey, and the Bitcoin way is helping you exactly finding that correct setup for you personally. They are also helping you with securing your own cybersecurity. And if you want to go one step above all that, you can even get a consultation for a Plan B residency. Go to thebitcoinway.com/Robin and you will get a 30-minute free consultation. I know how big of a hurdle it can be to have self-custody, but it's so freaking important to make that first step. We have to make sure it's as easy and simple as possible. And that's exactly what BitBox did. BitBox created the simplest and the easiest hardware wallet to use to get into self-custody. So get yourself a BitBox down from the link in the description. And when you use code Robin, you even get a 5% discount. You can like what people are doing with their Bitcoin and with their games they're playing, but still choose to like, hey, I stick with the most sovereign way because I know this is the right side, this is the safe side even. You mentioned it. Why do you think differently about governments buying Bitcoin?
Well, because the only way they can buy Bitcoin is through theft. And just as a libertarian, I'm not a big fan of that. They're going to print money or, they talk about budget neutral ways, but we're already running, a $2 trillion deficit. And they already are only funded by the fact that they're able to steal through taxes or inflation. The only way they could accumulate Bitcoin in a semi-fair way would be through mining. But even still, what's buying the ASICs, right? Well, taxes or, theft of some kind. And so, I think just as practically as a libertarian, I can't rationalize how we support that. I think, I think beyond that, the government has never done anything, almost anything right. And so I don't know why supporting their acquisition of the best form of money, what I would prefer to be the people's money, is a productive exercise. Now, I've heard people make compelling cases, smart people make compelling cases for it. But I think in general, the whole point for me is it's an opt-out. It's a separation of money and state. It's the opt-out of everything. And my concern with government adoption of Bitcoin, even if they could do it in a way that wasn't theft, which I don't perceive to be truly possible, is does it then just become this digital Fort Knox, just like gold has, and nothing in the world actually changes? Everyone gets wealthy because the price of gold goes up, and now everyone gets wealthy because the price of Bitcoin goes up. And by everyone, I mean a very small percentage of us who actually understand and own Bitcoin. But nothing about the world changes. The incentives don't change. Like our economy and society aren't realigned in some meaningful way because of Bitcoin. It's just sitting there for lots and lots of people to, maybe eventually sell off a little bit. But I think I guess I would summarize my two biggest complaints is the only way that I see governments accumulating Bitcoin would be through some form of theft or use of, swapping assets that they probably shouldn't have to begin with. Printing money but I don't know. I think governments, like I view government as the enemy. I don't view government as my friend. And the fact that they can pump my bags, which I'm fully aware of, they could make Bitcoin go to $1 million if they started just buying it up and they kicked off the game theory and governments around the world were buying it. I would be much, much, much wealthier. But my son would not be safe from the prospect of a future war that he gets drafted to. And that's a big trade-off to make. Like my ultimate goal in life isn't exclusively wealth. I think that's coming, So in the meantime, I want to push forward a narrative that inspires people to think beyond that, to lower their time preference beyond their wealth, and think about, what's the world I want my kids to grow up in? What's the world I want to be experiencing? I'm in my 30s. I've got hopefully a bit of a runway ahead of me. When I'm 70, what world do I want to experience? And when I have my grandkids, what world do I want them to experience? And a bunch of stolen Bitcoin effectively sitting in a digital Fort Knox, I don't think does any good for anyone necessarily.
Interesting. I love that view. But it's like,
what's your take on the SBR?
I hope that I count on the ignorance of governments to new technology. In the EU, I can count on that a little bit more than in America. It seems like they get it faster. But even now, they have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But honestly, they just put a different name on the Bitcoin they already had.
For now, that's true. Yeah.
Till now, it's not really. Till now, it's not really anything. I mean, there are some states that passes some bills. I'm not fully informed on how far they've gone, and if there are any states that already bought some Bitcoin, or is it just rumors and some discussions currently going on. And we know. Supposedly, America holds a lot of gold. Maybe that's supposedly. I don't know, like if it's actually true or not. I cannot verify that. But if they want to do the same thing with Bitcoin, I mean, if they want to have the same amount of Bitcoin that they hold supposedly with gold, that's a lot of Bitcoin. I don't know if they even could come to that, because as you say, if the word gets out and we know that America is buying Bitcoin, like actually aggressively trying to accumulate Bitcoin, I think the price just runs away very quickly. The same way as if, I don't know, Apple comes out tomorrow and puts a statement of like, okay, 10% of our balance sheet is already converted to Bitcoin. I think the price just shoots up to like 1 million or like 500,000, whatever the thing is. So I count on, if they adopt Bitcoin, they might accumulate Bitcoin, but they also kind of sign on the death of the money printer, and long term they will lose the Bitcoin, because the only way they can hold the Bitcoin if they get more Bitcoin. So I don't know. It's really hard for me to see a world that is fully Bitcoin and a world where the government has a lot of power. So I don't know, those two do not go good together. I think there is room for service providers, for central institutions that provide services where you pay a fee for that. I don't know, like if there's a service that provides streets and you pay for those streets to drive on. So you would call it a fee and not a tax, because it's actually associated with an actual cost. And that's where I like that future. I'm very much subscribed to the sovereign individual, that kind of future. But yeah, I think government. I'm a fan of governments not buying Bitcoin. But I don't know what happens if they aggressively buy Bitcoin, because I cannot control if they buy or not. I just wish they wouldn't. But the question is, like, if they do, what actually happens then?
Yeah, and I don't know. The answer for me is I don't know what happens. I guess maybe the nuance I would add to all of my arguments is I think over some long enough time frame, Bitcoin does win in the way that I think we want it to win. That I'm talking, a better world kind of win. I think the question though, but like, that's kind of meaningless if it's 100 years from now. And in between now and then, tons of people continue to suffer, and we have 50 more wars and like all these things. Like, my question is, like, what can we do to push and promote that, like bring that prosperous future closer to the present? And I think that, using Bitcoin to pay down the debt, maybe there's a good argument to be made that, well, they accumulate a bunch of Bitcoin, they use it to pay down the debt, and then that spreads the Bitcoin into the world in, some useful way that people now have. There's broad enough adoption of Bitcoin sort of forced upon these holders to use Bitcoin as money. And, maybe, But I think in the interim, I think it sits probably as a digital Fort Knox and doesn't really get used. And maybe some of the debt's paid down. But as long as the money printer still exists, then there's no real incentive for the forever wars to stop. And the incentives are just so broken. I don't want, and this is, probably cognitive dissonance here is like, I don't want the economy to collapse, but I struggle to see how we get out of the mess that we're in, even if governments are adopting Bitcoin. There's so many variables at play, right? And I think the people, like people at BPI, who I think are great people operating in good faith. Even though I don't necessarily disagree with their stance on government accumulation of Bitcoin, and certainly in aggregate, they're much smarter than I am by myself. They can't foresee all of the potential implications of what governments adopting Bitcoin means. Just like I can't, conceive all the implications of Bitcoin not being adopted by governments. You brought up, So that's maybe one point. You brought up states adopting a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I think it was like New Hampshire and maybe Arizona and did end up getting it through. As a philosophically as a libertarian, I think I'm as opposed to that as any. That said, I think practically, the closer that we can bring these determinations to home, the better. And like that's why I think the individual, the family unit, like those are the ultimate entities to be making these decisions. It's a little bit worse, but still way better than the federal government making decisions if it's your town or your local community, or better yet, even the subdivision, or like the people you live near. And then states are worse, but still a lot better than the federal government. And it just sort of goes out, like the closer these decisions about what are we using for money, how are we going to live our lives, the closer those decisions could be made to home, I think the better the world's going to be. And maybe my biggest concern with what are the externalities of the federal government buying is the federal government has proven time and time again, they're not operating in my best interest. And also it's a bunch of crazy people. I mean, look at Trump and Elon right now. Like, I thought we dodged a bullet that we didn't have Harris, as president, and Tim Walz as our VP, but the world, it's not looking awesome. Like we got a bunch of like childish men bickering on Twitter right now and accusing each other of things. And so I am so distrustful the further from my home that I get, that the more we can do to bring those decisions back to the individual, the better. And so part of it is, I understand, philosophical, but I think part of it's also practical. We don't want the economy to collapse. I'm not really sure how exactly Bitcoin smoothed that transition, but I think if it has a chance of doing so, it's probably because individuals adopt it, not because governments or large corporations do.
But it's interesting how Elon reacted to the debt ceiling raising, which was kind of like, of course it happens. Like I don't know if anyone ever doubted that they don't raise it. It's the only thing the Republicans and the Democrats actually agree on, and that government will spend more money. I don't know if Elon Musk actually believed that he can reverse government spending. Like for me, this was so clear that they will spend more money than they make. You can't undo that. The system is too big for that. There needs to be a dictator, and this dictator needs to be someone that is really, really convinced of that, and everyone has to play with him in order for governments to spend less and actually get the step down. Like otherwise, the debt will just keep growing. So I think that's like almost a natural law.
Yeah. Man, I don't know what to make of like Doge and all of that. I think Elon's a smart guy. I can't imagine that he went in really thinking that they were going to cut $2 trillion. They were just going to eliminate the deficit, right? I mean, certainly he understood politics well enough to know that there's a massive voting bloc relying on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and that's what you have to cut. In the DOD, right? So like you've got, and like I say this as like a former kind of conservative Republican type of guy. you've got a huge block of people who view the more we spend on military, the better. Like that makes us more powerful. Never mind the fact that we could probably cut, military spending by 80 or 90% and be, go lean and efficient and be just as, effective. Not that I want us to be so effective in our military presence, but you'd think that someone like Musk would have understood that most of what you need to mess with is just completely politically off limits. Like you simply can't do anything about it. And, but to me, that's the hope of Bitcoin is, before Bitcoin, we're in this $37-ish trillion worth of debt. I don't know what you do. I mean, I guess you run to gold, but like, there's no real hope for a brighter future on a gold standard. And again, in a digital global economy, but we have Bitcoin, like opt out, like just say enough and buy some Bitcoin, or earn in Bitcoin if you can, sell a good service, launch a podcast and accept Bitcoin as payment, get as much of it as you can, and then just take it into self-custody. Like don't leave it on the exchange. Don't trust it to someone else. Don't buy a paper product. That's the beauty of it. So we just recorded a podcast, our internal show, Bitcoin Banter. And, we were talking about the Musk Trump divorce. And, Rick, one of our guys, said he thinks that, this was all just kind of a charade. Like they knew this wasn't going to work and and I don't know that I have a strong feeling about that, but it wouldn't surprise me. No, I mean, nothing would surprise me at this point. So like, did they know that Doge was going to fail and now they have some scapegoat and we have to raise the debt ceiling? And it's just, they know they need to turn the money printers on or default and just absolute economic calamity. This is going to be their excuse. We have to avoid economic catastrophe. We have to raise the debt ceiling to non-existence and print and print and print. And I think that's why Larry Lepard's book, The Big Print, is one of my favorites. I think it really illustrates the absolute corruption of the system and why, like, ultimately his thesis is right. That's what's going to play out.
100%. And we mentioned Bitcoin Prague now so many times. This podcast will actually come out while Bitcoin Prague is already going on. So for people not to be confused.
Catch me on the main stage, guys.
And I'm really looking forward, just as a side note, I will have in the VIP stage, when this comes out yesterday, but like on Saturday or like on Friday, at Bitcoin Prague, a fireside chat with Larry Lepard. And I'm really looking forward to that because it's unrecorded. And I feel like people are even a little bit more, relaxed and even giving a little bit more away when there's not the recording going on. And Larry Lepard is someone that just like doesn't sugarcoat it. So seeing him unrecorded, I think it will be fun, or was fun yesterday.
Yeah, no, Larry's awesome. I was just on the phone with him this morning. We're trying to help him get some books to Prague. I don't think he'll mind me saying this. We're trying to help him order books to sign in Prague. And I'll tell you what, Amazon is about as fiat as it gets. He's had a hell of a time doing that. And so we're trying to do what we can to make sure he's got books to sign when he gets there.
Absolutely. Really, really cool. One last topic that I want to get into with you, when the time flew by, is OpReturn and kind of internal wars that we have in Bitcoin, be it on the technical side, but those kind of things. We kind of mentioned the narrative wars before, but and I think like an interesting addition to that is like OpReturn and other discussions. I'm personally not a big expert on that. I think you also said like you're not super deep on the technical side, but I feel like you have an opinion on that still.
Yeah, I would say I have a half-baked opinion, and it's very much less technical in nature, and so you take anything I say with a grain of salt. So first of all, I would say that I look at sort of the two competing sides on this debate, and I ask I'm sort of in a position where I have to trust and not verify because I'm not a developer, and just don't understand the intricacies of the protocol as well as I would like and hope to someday. I look at the fix the filters people and Bitcoin Mechanic and Matthew Crater and there's sort of a list of them. And I have learned a lot from that crew, not exclusively about the filters, but just Bitcoin, my understanding of Bitcoin, And I look at the other side, and they're, a lot of them are dancing around in wizard hats, or, I think you can probably tell which direction I'm heading with this. And so my inclination is to, or they support, like very clearly to me, shit coins. Or they have a vested financial interest in spamming the network, it seems, but by my loose definition of the word spam. Again, like we can get into semantics. What does that mean? So I tend to be more of a fix the filters guy. I understand that that OpReturn discussion is a mempool policy issue. It's not, what actually gets into the block is going to end up on your node regardless. But I don't think that means we don't try plugging the holes as we go, is sort of my general feeling. I think the other thing that I've had an issue with, and I know both sides are yelling at each other, and probably people have said very stupid things in both directions. But I think maybe my biggest turnoff from the pro removal of the OpReturn limit side is the way that they've sort of addressed this as like you're not a core developer, and so you shouldn't have an opinion. And to me, that's a very dangerous position to take, because it's sort of this effort to remove any argument because you aren't the expert. And I think if there's anything I've learned in the last 5 years, it's that I don't trust the experts. And the fact that you're a core developer does not make you an expert on money or monetary policy or macro. It doesn't mean that you suddenly have a crystal ball into the implications of the decisions you're making. And so for those reasons, I tend to be, again, take it as a grain of salt, but something more of an ossification person when it comes to the protocol. I understand that there is probably development that could be done to make Bitcoin more useful as money and as a medium of exchange. And I'm in no way suggesting that that's not the case, but we're also at a point in Bitcoin's existence that there are millions and millions of people who aren't necessarily Bitcoiners, but are in some way through proxy, like the ETFs, or they're invested in the NASDAQ, and so they've got exposure to MicroStrategy or something. They're in some way sort of reliant on the reliability of the Bitcoin protocol. And so making changes without a full understanding of what the long-term consequences of that is, or of what they are, I think is dangerous. And I think I would say any change needs to be very, very, very conservative. And I think to the extent that you can, Bitcoin's still a small enough, ship in this ocean of, global assets, the extent that we can still try to find some level of consensus about these changes being made is very helpful. I know you're never going to achieve perfect consensus. And I'm referring to consensus just an idea, not obviously consensus on the protocol. I think that would be best. To me, I've talked to very few people, like at the conference, on my podcast, who just have sided with the core developers, honestly. Like most people their view is Bitcoin is money, and I'm unconvinced that this change is beneficial to the promotion of Bitcoin is money. And to me, that just doesn't seem like a risk worth taking. And I don't think we just throw up our hands and give up and say, well, they're going to spam anyway. We plug the holes that we can, and then we hope that the free market prices the spammers out in the long run. And I think that's probably likely to happen. But again, it's tough, because I just can't get into the technical details of it without being wrong or sounding like an idiot. But that's sort of the way I'm sort of approaching how I think about this.
It's very similar to how I also think it's in general to any, and I mean, I was a software developer beforehand, but I wouldn't call myself an expert when it comes to software, especially not to Bitcoin. You really have to study it very deeply to understand it. But I always argue for any change, like even outside of OpReturn, you have to have an extremely good reason why you change it. And if you're in doubt if it is good, it's probably better to keep it the way it is and make a conservative choice. So I think we need probably down the road some changes to Bitcoin. If we just keep it as it is and we never change anything, we probably run into problems in, 10 years, 50 years, 200 years, whatever. But the reason has to be so good and so critical that you're like, okay, we have to do this. Like it has to be almost obvious that we have to make that change. And that's how I view any change. And I just haven't seen a compelling enough argument for that change. But yeah.
The fact that you've got smart people on both sides who disagree so vehemently about this, to me, indicates probably going conservative and not making the change makes a lot more sense. I think there are going to be changes, and I know there will be fighting, and this is part of the beauty of Bitcoin, is that we fight over things that we think are important. There will be fighting, but like when the quantum problem materializes, which, you know, that's not like something I'm concerned about in the short term, but I let's presume that it is a problem at some point. I think it'll be much easier to find consensus amongst people involved, because it's, you know, potentially an existential threat to the Bitcoin network. And I bet that gets rolled out a lot easier. In the meantime, these sorts of things where it's like, well, we want to, you know, play with these opcodes. I would just say Bitcoin is not perfect, and it's still working as money. Like, I mean, the Bitcoin way literally operates on a Bitcoin standard. We won't accept anything but Bitcoin. We won't pay you in anything but Bitcoin. They pay me in Bitcoin. Like we operate on a Bitcoin standard. It does work. And we primarily use on-chain, which I know isn't like probably what the future holds, because I think eventually people are going to be priced out of, you know, owning their own UTXOs and all that. But there's Lightning. There's, you know, there are these other tools that people are already using. And to me, at least, that gives me a lot of hope that we can play conservative in the meantime, and we don't need to make, you know, these sweeping changes that at least half, and to me, I perceive it to be much more than half of the, you know, the Bitcoin community. And I know that's a term people don't like, that the Bitcoin community seems to resent and oppose. So yeah, play conservative. That's kind of my hope, especially with as much as is on the line at the moment with, you know, with, I mean, nation states and, you know, Wall Street getting here. There are a lot of people who are going to be touched by Bitcoin in some way that, you know, weren't a few years ago.
I very much agree with that. I have one question to ask each and every one of my guests, and the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Oh boy, what can you learn from, man? Well, so the question I always ask at the end of my podcast is, give me an unpopular opinion that you have. So I'm trying to think of like, what's something that I could share that's maybe a little bit controversial beyond Bitcoin. Besides understanding Bitcoin, one of the things I am most proud of is my family. And I have 3 beautiful kids, a beautiful wife, and I can assure you I'm not a perfect husband or a perfect father. One of the things that I've learned, though, parenting, is that it's a very low time preference thing. And if you do it right. And so what I always tell people, to the extent that they're interested in my opinion on parenting, is discipline hard and love harder. And I think that a lot of people, this 21st century mentality of, you know, gentle parenting and, you know, you don't want to offend your kids and blah, 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 I think is nonsense. I think you need to instill a sense of discipline in them. And you do that at a very young age. And then if you're doing it right, my experience has been 5 minutes later, your kids are running back to you to play and be cuddled and that sort of thing. So I think hopefully my takeaway would be that, you know, if you can learn one other thing from me, it's that parenting is low time preference. Love is important, but so is discipline.
I love that. Discipline hard, love harder. That's amazing.
That's my mantra.
Really cool. We have an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you the question, what is the most random thing you have ever collected?
The most random thing I've ever collected? Let's see. I don't know if this counts. When I was a kid, my brother and I had like a nice little snake collection going. We played outside a lot, and we'd catch these little garter snakes, and I probably had 5 or 6 of them at once. And then one of them would die after a while because we didn't know how to feed them or anything. And then a new one would come along, and we'd add them to the collection. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
That is very random. I love that. Then thank you so much, Michael, for being on the podcast. Before we let you go, where can people find you and ask questions?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at the other M Jordan because I'm the other Michael Jordan. But make sure you go check out the Bitcoin Way. It's thebitcoinway.com. You can schedule a free 30-minute consult with a member of our team. We help with 100% self-custody, no key sharing, no KYC, none of the nonsense, self-sovereignty. We also help with online privacy phones. We got a Plan B residency option. And again, it's www.thebitcoinway.com. And you can check us out on X as well. We've got a great memer on our team. So lots of fun content. It's at the Bitcoin Way _.
Absolutely. The Bitcoin Way link is in my description, and your link to your Twitter will also be in the description. So people can just click on that and directly go there. So thank you so much, Michael, for being on. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.